Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a bit less scholarly and a lot more botanical. A journey through the hazy, aromatic realm of medieval mind alteration. Yeah, they absolutely did it, but believe me, things got bizarre and sometimes surprisingly inventive, so before you settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. But only if you really dig what we're doing here, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see who's joining us from across the globe. Now turn down those lights, maybe flip on a fan for that gentle background noise, and let's settle into tonight's exploration together. It's easy to picture the Middle Ages as a dreary, filth-covered procession of clerics, disease and root vegetables. But beneath all that rough fabric and misery, there were humans. Regular, imperfect, curious humans who sometimes looked at a peculiar plant and thought, well, let's find out what happens if I mix this into some heated wine. And honestly, who could judge them? There was no electric lighting, no caffeine, no mood stabilizers. And the local entertainment was either watching some night attempt literacy or wondering how long your neighbour could keep gyrating before succumbing to grain fungus toxicity. So if someone mentioned there was a fungus that made you temporarily forget about serfdom, you'd probably sample it too. Despite popular belief, the idea of using substances to broaden consciousness, flee suffering, or simply make your existence slightly less miserable wasn't uncommon. It was woven directly into their society, but it wasn't labelled getting stoned. There were no medieval buddy comedies chuckling behind the grain stacks. It was wrapped in language like transcendent experiences, sacred revelation, medical treatment, or in dire situations, oh no. Healers employed herbs, clerics cultivated them, sorceresses, based on who you consulted, administered them, and nearly everyone encountered these compounds, somehow through treatment, ceremony, or accidental ingestion of contaminated grain. Once more, the spectrum of medieval intoxicants wasn't restricted to a mug of warm ale, though that certainly helped. They had roots that shrieked, blossoms that clouded sight, seeds that triggered prophetic slumber, and salves that made people convinced they were soaring naked across the heavens. With the Devil's Catering crew, getting altered wasn't always for fun. It was therapeutic, sacred, or sometimes just really bad decision-making on an empty belly, and based on your social position, it might have been provided by a surgeon, a sister, or a shoeless farmer called Wolf, who learned it from a remarkably intelligent rodent. In the medieval realm, you didn't require a sketchy backstreet or an exclusive nightclub to obtain consciousness-changing substances. All you required was a plot of land, a grinding bowl and pestle, and a casual disregard for proper measurements. Because back then, the natural world was your supplier, and she wasn't always kind. Medieval Europe was brimming with vegetation, roots, mushrooms, and gums that could either relieve your headache or convince you that you'd wed a maple tree. The boundary between treatment and mystical journey was, shall we say, creatively interpreted. Doctors, monks, birth attendants and travelling plant experts all experimented with botany with different degrees of education and passion. If you needed something to render you unconscious, settle your anxiety, or make you glimpse the divine in your stew, they had solutions. Consider henbane, for instance. This vegetation was like the natural world's version of chance gambling. Correctly prepared, it reduced suffering and induced slumber. Incorrectly prepared, it presented you with a completely new array of complications like seizures and an overwhelming urge to discard your footwear while sprinting through the forest yelling. Or mandrake. The root formed somewhat like a human shape. Folklore claimed it wailed when extracted from the earth, a sound so deadly it could eliminate a person. That didn't prevent people from digging it up regardless, typically by attaching it to a canine and maintaining distance. Consuming mandrake could produce unconsciousness, apparitions, and on fortunate occasions, prophetic dreams. On unfortunate occasions, well, you wouldn't require herbs any longer. Then there was belladonna, also called deadly nightshade, which is precisely the sort of title that warns maybe reconsider. It was applied to expand pupils for attractiveness, but also to address pain, induce hallucinations, and occasionally demise. Medieval wellness was a daring enterprise. These plants were frequently combined into liquid tinctures, oils, or those notorious flying salves we'll discuss shortly. And they weren't always ingested willingly. Sometimes they were administered during religious rituals, medical treatments, or by a caring pharmacist who believed a bit more root wouldn't harm. But harm it definitely could. Henbane. The medieval equivalent of let's discover what this switch does, known to plant scientists as Hyoscyamus niger, and to everybody else as the substance that made Uncle Bernard believe he was waterfowl. Henbane was a cornerstone of the Middle Ages unofficial drugstore used throughout Europe for generations. Henbane wasn't merely a casual plant, it was an experience. Monks documented its characteristics in botanical guides, doctors employed it to reduce pain, sorceresses used it to ride brooms through their fantasies, and commoners mainly, hoped to avoid consuming it accidentally. So what precisely did henbane accomplish? Well, that's complicated. In modest amounts, it functioned as a tranquilizer. It could relieve dental pain, assist with sleeplessness, and make birthing somewhat less agonizing. In other terms, it was the medieval equivalent of take a couple and try not to wail. But in greater amounts, or just poorly measured ones, henbane could trigger delirium, visions, frantic agitation, and sometimes a sincere discussion with a root vegetable you believed was your departed grandmother. It contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, which disrupt brain messengers. To put it unscientifically, your medieval mind gets strange quickly. Visual distortions, confusion, parched mouth, intense thirst, and spontaneous bursts of expressive movement were all possible outcomes. Henbane was frequently smoked, steeped into beverages, or even mixed with fat and rubbed on the flesh, a favoured delivery approach for anyone who didn't prefer their awareness organised in a straight line. Now, was it permitted? Technically, yes. Regulated substances weren't a concept yet, but it was disputed, especially with the church. Anything that modified perception was questionable. Visions were meant to originate from holy figures, not vegetation. Still, henbane had supporters among healers, mystics, and people with nothing left to risk. It even found its way into beer formulas before being prohibited in favour of safer additions like hops. Few plants in the medieval realm were as dreaded, respected, and dramatically misunderstood as mandrake, a root so powerful and strangely human-formed that it generated a mixture of botany, folklore, and pure terror. Botanically labelled as Mandragora officinarum, the mandrake was connected with sleep, hallucinations, fertility, and a strong likelihood of either mystical visions or awakening in a ditch beside a bewildered goat. Either way, something occurred. Medieval plant specialists believed that the root, which frequently looked like a stocky, twisted human form, held powerful magical and medicinal qualities. It was a sedative, an anaesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and, according to some, a pathway to prophetic dreams. You could simmer it in wine to ease pain, or you could breathe its vapours and instantly doubt all your existence choices. But the real notoriety of the mandrake came from its supposed tendency of wailing when unearthed. Yes, wailing as in don't extract me from the soil or you'll perish from the sound kind of wailing. Medieval writings cautioned that simply hearing the mandrake scream could kill a person, which naturally resulted in some inventive harvesting methods. The most celebrated involved securing the root to a dog, walking away, and allowing the unfortunate animal to handle the dangerous task. The assumption was that the dog would perish instead of you, a strategy that raises some moral concerns, even by medieval standards. Once harvested and the dog appropriately mourned, the mandrake could be dried, ground, steeped, or worn as a talisman. Some people even carried miniature mandrake figures in pouches to repel evil or enhance fertility. Because nothing expresses romance like a preserved root that appears like it's witnessed things, the church, predictably, wasn't fond of mandrakes. Anything that produced visions and wasn't connected to organised religion was regarded as witchcraft adjacent. Still, monks documented mandrake formulas in herbals with suspiciously thorough directions. Used properly, mandrake could reduce pain before operations, address insomnia, and generate trippy vivid dreams. Used improperly, it could cause nausea, unconsciousness, or your relatives staging an exorcism because you believed your soup was murmuring. Let's say you're a medieval lady hoping to draw attention at a banquet. You could don your finest cloth. You could weave flowers into your hair. Or if you were truly determined, you could drip actual poison into your eyes. Enter belladonna, also known as a troppa belladonna or, more truthfully, deadly nightshade. The title alone sounds like a final adversary in a medieval game. And yes, it was both captivating and fatal, the botanical equivalent of a seductive but unstable weapon. The term belladonna means beautiful woman because when a few drops of its essence were added to the eyes, it expanded the pupils. Large eyes were considered appealing, mysterious, and maybe even slightly divine. Naturally, the drawback was blurred vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended poisoning. But hey, beauty standards have never been especially forgiving. Cosmetics aside, belladonna had other abilities. It was used as a pain reliever, a sleep aid, and occasionally as a truth serum, though the truth it generated was often along the lines of the ceiling is leaking Latin prayers. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, both of which interfere with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to why is the wallpaper pulsating? It was a frequent ingredient in potions, flying salves, and some very questionable medical procedures. Want to numb a patient before amputating a limb? Belladonna. Want to simulate a death-like sleep for theatrical or suspicious purposes? Belladonna. Want to accidentally encounter a few saints and possibly the devil in your dreams? You understand the concept. And yet, despite its toxicity, belladonna was part of the medieval medical arsenal. Doctors used it carefully or recklessly, depending on how severe the plague was that week. And it appears in herbals, formulas, and love charms across Europe before modern edibles came in discreet packaging and fruity tastes. Medieval folks were already getting creative, just not with chocolate. Instead, they relied on salves, balms, tinctures, and potions. And let's be clear, the word salve rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Welcome to the realm of medieval skin-absorbed delivery systems. Or in simple terms, rubbing strange paste on your skin and hoping for the best. These mixtures weren't made for a casual weekend buzz. Many were tied to rituals, folk medicine, and spiritual experiences. They could knock you unconscious, send you into ecstatic trances, or, if misused, cause you to believe you were transforming into a reptile. Application was often topical, which sounds safer until you learn the preferred absorption points were the mucous membranes. Yes, those membranes. Cue the infamous flying salves associated with witches. A delightful blend of henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and pig fat, often applied to, let's just say, intimate areas. The objective? A euphoric sensation of flying. The outcome? Either a transcendent astral journey or waking up in a haystack with half your teeth and no memory of how you arrived there. Beyond the salves, medieval potions were often consumed in wine, broth, or some liquid that smelled like regret. Pharmacists loved mixing poppy extract with spiced wine, a combination strong enough to numb you during surgery, or give you a front row seat to a divine revelation you didn't request. And let's not forget the elixirs sold by wandering charlatans. These travelling pharmacists promised to cure everything from heartbreak to plague, often using recipes that could also dissolve a shoe. Did they work? Maybe. Or maybe they just made you forget what was wrong in the first place. The magic of these medieval edibles was that no one could quite predict the result. Would you sleep peacefully, commune with angels, or scream at the moon and swear eternal loyalty to a turnip? Only one way to find out. Let's discuss the broomstick, that iconic airborne companion of the medieval witch. It might seem charming now, the stuff of fairy tales and Halloween costumes, but back then it came with an awkwardly scandalous backstory. The broomstick wasn't just for sweeping. The connection between witches and broomsticks actually has chemical origins. And no, not just mandrake. Historical records, especially those written by suspicious inquisitors, describe witches using flying salves. Thick, trance-inducing balms made from plants like henbane, belladonna and datura, all of which are about as friendly as a drunk porcupine. But here's the twist. These salves weren't taken by mouth. Why? Because the ingredients were toxic and stomachs are famously ungrateful. Instead, they were applied topically. And by topically, we mean mucous membranes. And by mucous membranes, we mean, yes, exactly what you're thinking. Hence the broomstick, or, as some sources delicately phrased it, a staff. Anointed for transportation, the handle was used as a vehicle for applying the salve to areas with high absorption. Not exactly family-friendly, but highly effective. Within minutes, users reported visions of flying through the night sky, attending feasts with the devil, or simply hovering above the village like the world's most confused drone. Of course, these were hallucinations, but in an era where medicine, magic, and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one questioned it much. Inquisitors and theologians took note, of course, not because they were interested in pharmacology, but because they saw flying as evidence of consorting with demons, which is ironic considering the hallucinations were chemically induced and deeply unreliable. But when has medieval justice ever needed evidence? While medieval Europe was busy applying poison to broomsticks and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east in the thriving cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Enter hashish, the plant-based answer to existential dread and camel traffic. Derived from cannabis resin, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. And unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests field testing. Hashish was often consumed orally, usually mixed with honey, spices or other herbs, making it the first edible to actually taste good, as opposed to medieval Europe's tradition of bitter teas and things that smelled like spoiled socks. Its use wasn't just recreational, though. Yes, that absolutely happened. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where practitioners sought spiritual union with the divine. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation, or, at the very least, encourage long, thoughtful stares at walls. In fact, many Sufi poets and philosophers spoke of hashish the way modern songwriters speak about bad breakups, with intense emotion, abstract metaphors, and just enough fog to make you wonder if they were okay. Of course, not everyone was a fan. Many Islamic rulers tried to ban hashish use periodically, fearing it led to laziness, moral decay, or people giggling too much during prayer. But, like most substance bans in history, this had roughly the same success rate as teaching a cat to juggle the legendary hashashin. The original assassins were even said to have used hashish before missions to get into the proper mindset for stabbing. That claim's mostly myth, but it's a great example of how cannabis-based products were already wrapped in both mystique and suspicion. Meanwhile, Europe was centuries away from understanding how to use cannabis without immediately setting something on fire or calling it devil grass. When you picture a medieval church, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, solemn chanting, and that thick, almost otherworldly cloud of incense wafting through the air like God's personal fog machine. But incense wasn't just about holiness. It also had a little something extra psychoactive potential. Let's start with the two heavy hitters, frankincense and myrrh. both resinous substances imported from the Arabian Peninsula and East Africa, burned in churches, temples, and royal courts. They were meant to cleanse the air, ward off evil spirits, and make everything smell slightly less like unwashed wool and fish stew. But here's the twist. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, particularly incensol acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sat in enough smoke, Gregorian chant wasn't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, which is to say all of them, prolonged exposure to incense could cause a mild tranquilizing effect, especially if paired with fasting, dehydration, or extreme boredom. It wasn't uncommon for monks or devotees to report visions during long services, and while they often credited divine inspiration, it's possible some were just lightly buzzed from resin fumes. And if you think this was limited to Christian spaces, think again. Incense was a common fixture in mosques, synagogues, Buddhist temples, and even pre-Christian pagan rites. It transcended religion. Everyone loves a good vibe. Apparently, clerics insisted the incense helped lift the soul to heaven. Realistically, it may have just softened the edges of reality enough to make 5-hour sermons a bit more tolerable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of putting on lo-fi beats and lighting a scented candle, but with more Latin and less chill. If there was one thing medieval people could count on besides taxes and the occasional plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider. You name it, someone was brewing it in a wooden barrel behind their house and calling it medicine. And in a way it was. Water wasn't exactly safe to drink. Most natural sources were either contaminated or casually downstream from livestock, which meant sipping from a stream was basically playing intestinal roulette. So instead, people reached for something a little more fermented. Enter small beer, the medieval version of sparkling water, but with alcohol and a much higher chance of being brewed by someone named Edith, who measured ingredients by intuition and prayer. This low-alcohol drink was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a light buzz and regular hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so tame. If you were wealthier or simply had fewer plans for the day, you might opt for stronger ale, honey mead, or imported wine. And yes, wine was often mixed with herbs or spices, either for flavour, medicinal effect, or just to see what happened. In monasteries, brewing beer was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste-tested the results, often with great enthusiasm. If salvation came in pints, the Benedictines were well ahead of the curve. But alcohol wasn't just a drink. It was a lifestyle enhancer. Want to dull the pain of medieval dentistry? Ale. Want to treat melancholy? Spiced wine. Want to forget you live in a drafty hovel with 6 other people and 100 extremely judgmental chickens? Mead. Taverns, inns and roadside alehouses served as medieval therapy offices, only with more yelling. People drank to celebrate, mourn, gossip, and occasionally invent entirely new dance styles no one asked for. Sometimes getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a choice, it was just breakfast. Enter ergot, a parasitic fungus that grows on rye and other cereal grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it looked like a slightly weird blackened kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval nightmare: convulsions, hallucinations, burning limbs, and occasionally the sensation that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original acid trip. Centuries before the Summer of Love, Woodstock, or anything with tie-dye, people in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damp regions like France and the Germanic territories, frequently baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because hunger trumps fungus awareness. And so, entire villages would unknowingly ingest ergot-laced loaves, and the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were 2 forms of ergotism. Yes, it had a name. Convulsive ergotism, characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and fits of laughter or panic. Gangrenous ergotism, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs blackening, shriveling, and falling off. Not ideal for dinner parties. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behaviour, including dancing plagues, where groups of people danced uncontrollably for days, sometimes until death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, divine punishment, or moral weakness. But in reality, it may have just been a mass case of unintentional mushroom toast. Ironically, the Order of St. Anthony, which ran hospitals for the afflicted, helped treat victims of ergotism, often by feeding them wheat-based diets instead of rye. So, yes, the cure was different bread. Did people connect the dots? Not really. To a medieval baker, bread was either fine or definitely possessed. And no one was testing for psychoactive alkaloids in their porridge. They were too busy trying not to be excommunicated. Even today, some scholars believe ergot played a role in the Salem witch trials. Hallucinations, fits, paranoia, all very ergot-y. But that's still debated. What's not debated? Medieval Europe got high on toast and didn't even know it. You've heard of magic mushrooms, you've heard of flying salves, but have you ever heard of mad honey? Yes, in a few special corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on it. This wasn't your average grocery store honey. Mind you, we're talking about a rare type produced in the mountainous Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feasted on rhododendron flowers. Pretty pink blooms with a dark secret. They're laced with grey anotoxins, naturally occurring compounds that don't play nicely with the human nervous system. The result? Mad honey, a substance so potent it could bring on dizziness, hallucinations, vomiting, slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions, usually in that order. Consumed in small doses, it offered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. This wasn't just a local curiosity. It was weaponized. According to ancient and medieval sources, invading armies were once deliberately poisoned with mad honey. Left behind in abandoned villages, soldiers thought they'd scored free snacks. Instead, they ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that bee vomit is not to be trusted. Greek and Roman authors like Xenophon and Strabo wrote about these effects centuries earlier, but the use persisted well into the Middle Ages. Locals knew how to handle the stuff. A little on bread for a headache, a little in wine for visions. Or none at all, if you actually wanted to remember your own name by dusk. Mad honey became known as a remedy and a recreational substance, especially in mystical or folk healing traditions. Some users claimed it brought prophetic dreams, while others just woke up clutching a potato they believed was their uncle. Results varied, and yes, it was traded. Some ambitious merchants sold it in small ceramic jars, usually without dosage instructions. Because who needs warning labels when you live in an era where leeches are considered sophisticated medicine? Not everyone in the Middle Ages was a priest, a noble, or a plague-ridden peasant. Some folks operated in the shadowy margins of society as shamans, herbalists, cunning folk, and other semi-legitimate practitioners of medicine and mischief. Think of them as medieval pharmacists with zero regulation and a deep personal relationship with moss. These were the people you visited when the local physicians suggested bloodletting for your toothache. They had no degrees, but they had herbal knowledge passed down through generations, often learned by watching Grandma treat boils with bark and dignity. When it came to consciousness-altering substances, these practitioners were your specialists. They understood which flora to crush into compounds, which tubers to steep in alcohol, and precisely how much of any given botanical would transport you to celestial realms rather than permanently relocate you there. Whether seeking pain management, prophetic visions, hexing rivals, or achieving transcendence during mundane tasks, they possessed multiple solutions. Most of these experts were female, birthing attendants, knowledgeable healers and medicine workers who served as cornerstones of their settlements while striking terror into governing authorities. Not due to cauldron-stirring theatrics, but because their expertise was vast and required no scholarly Latin for communication. Their preparations frequently contained nightshade family plants, mandrake root, deadly nightshade, and opium-based derivatives. They would blend these with fermented beverages, animal fats, sweeteners, or saliva. Seriously, they'd recite protective incantations and dispatch you carrying something that might restore your health or compel passionate admissions to imaginary transgressions. Naturally, when complications arose, perhaps hallucinations featuring airborne livestock or sudden desires to wed vegetation, responsibility swiftly transferred from poor preparation to supernatural malevolence. Religious institutions and regional leaders maintained vigilant surveillance on these individuals while nervously monitoring developments. Nevertheless, settlements depended upon their services. When offspring developed fevers, when limbs throbbed with pain, or when communication with deceased family members was needed to locate hidden savings, these were your contacts. They weren't physicians, they weren't clergy. They represented the original underground health and wellness advocates. Following all the ointments, concoctions, botanicals, preparations, aromatics, insects, and questionable baked goods, one major inquiry emerges. How did medieval society actually regard intoxication? Conflicted, profoundly and amusingly conflicted. For certain individuals, particularly healing practitioners and plant specialists, mind-altering compounds served practical purposes. If substances diminished suffering, calmed feverish thoughts, or rendered childbirth marginally less traumatic, they were embraced. This constituted medicine, not mischief. Certainly patients might begin reciting scripture in reverse or claiming felines spoke foreign languages. However, if inflammation subsided, victory was achieved. Then existed spiritual practitioners, religious devotees, mystics, and those pursuing divine correspondence. For these individuals, hallucinations weren't warning signals. They represented divine communications. Visions indicated holiness, not afflictions. If you gazed into emptiness and emptiness responded in ancient tongues, you were destined for canonization, or minimally earning personal shrine artwork. But motivation was crucial. Accidental intoxication was acceptable. Intoxication for encountering divinity was permissible. Intoxication for courting demonic entities created difficulties. Here, religious authorities intervened, labeling certain substances and their users as questionable at minimum, blasphemous at maximum. Anything involving control loss, whether inebriation, spiritual states, or inconvenient truthfulness, aroused ecclesiastical suspicion. Saints experienced visions. Commoners were likely just possessed. Meanwhile, among ordinary people, attitudes remained more tolerant. Your neighbour's sleep remedy might have functioned as a psychoactive nighttime beverage. People utilised opium wine for discomfort, cannabis for tranquility, and henbane infusions for managing difficult relatives. It wasn't perceived as mystical or rebellious. It was simply medicine cabinet contents alongside garlic and prayers. Ultimately, how intoxication was interpreted depended on your identity, your substances, and whether anyone reported you. In medieval thinking, altered consciousness existed in an ambiguous space between divine miracle and criminal offence, wellness and blasphemy. And in a reality where demons, saints, diseases, and vegetable shortages all coexisted, occasional botanical relief was hardly the most problematic concept. In the ancient world, the ocean wasn't an emptiness requiring traversal. It was civilization's pulsing core. It transported grain, precious metals, communications, armies, and sometimes conflict itself. Whoever controlled maritime routes didn't merely possess water, they determined entire civilizations' destinies. Unlike terrestrial combat, where landscape influenced engagements, naval warfare concerned controlling movement, commerce, messaging, and accessibility. For maritime empires like Athens, Carthage, and Egypt, oceanic dominance wasn't elective, it was survival. Without fleets, cities faced isolation, starvation, and encirclement. With fleets, they could strangle enemies, safeguard merchant vessels, and deploy forces far behind hostile territories. Consider the Mediterranean as illustration. It earned its Middle Sea designation purposefully. This enclosed ocean linked 3 continents and numerous civilizations. Controlling it meant influencing everything. From Phoenician commercial pathways to Roman grain deliveries. The sea delivered prosperity as rapidly as it brought catastrophe. Therefore, ancient powers invested heavily in naval infrastructure. Ports, construction facilities, maintenance docks, and maritime academies. For Athens, the navy became its lifeline. Themistocles' vision of a trireme-powered military transformed Athens into a thalassocracy, an ocean-based empire. Its vessels protected grain routes from Egypt, collected payments from partners, and destroyed Persian aspirations in battles like Salamis. Carthage, alternatively, emerged as a naval giant through mercantile trading routes. Its shipyards ranked among antiquity's most sophisticated manufacturing warships on nearly industrial scales. Carthaginian supremacy wasn't solely military power. It was supported by generations of seamen and navigators who knew the ocean intimately. Egypt, positioned strategically at the Nile's mouth and Red Sea, also depended heavily on fleets to defend trade with the Levant and Nubia. Though primarily river-focused, Egyptian warships evolved into ocean-capable vessels able to engage pirates and escort treasure convoys. In every instance, naval warfare wasn't secondary entertainment, it was the primary performance. The ocean was where adversaries collided, partnerships shattered, and empires either prospered or collapsed. Mastery of naval strategies, technology, and geography created legends, and when those fleets burned or sank, so did the fortunes of the powerful. The trireme wasn't merely a vessel, it was a weapon, streamlined, swift, and lethal. It characterized ancient naval combat throughout the Mediterranean, and while numerous city-states constructed them, none employed them quite like the Athenians. With 3 banks of oars and a bronze-tipped ram, the trireme was antiquity's equivalent of a precision missile, one propelled by perspiration, coordination, and tactics. A standard trireme measured approximately 120 feet long and merely 18 feet wide. Narrow, certainly, but that was intentional. Its slender hull enabled it to cut through water with minimal resistance, while its shallow draft allowed operation near coastlines for raids and landings. The name trireme derives from its 3 tiers of oars arranged vertically. These weren't random rowers. Each was a trained mariner, understanding synchronized movement at speeds, reaching 9 knots. In combat, the trireme's most terrifying feature was the ram, a bronze-sheathed prow reinforced with oak designed to shatter enemy hulls with devastating impact. But ramming wasn't simply about velocity. It demanded precise timing and positioning. Strike too directly, and your vessel might become lodged or capsize. Expert captains, like those in the Athenian navy, perfected the diekplaus, a maneuver involving slipping through enemy formations, turning rapidly and striking exposed sides. Above deck, the trireme carried a small contingent of marines, typically 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites and several archers. Their function was boarding enemy vessels or defending against boarders, but understand clearly, a trireme wasn't a floating fortress. It depended on agility, not armour. One mistake, and you became firewood. What made the Athenian trireme fleet truly revolutionary wasn't the ship alone, it was the supporting system. Financed by the Theoric Fund, a public naval treasury, Athens constructed and maintained hundreds of triremes. Citizens, including the poorest, served as rowers, creating an unusual maritime democracy. When Athens defeated the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BCE, victory didn't belong to aristocrats, it belonged to common citizens. Ancient naval combat wasn't a cannon-blasting slugfest. It resembled high-speed chess with occasional street fighting. The primary objective, disable or sink opponents before they could reciprocate. And the main instrument for that, ramming. Ramming was the cornerstone of naval tactics during the trireme period. The goal was piercing an enemy's hull below waterline using the ship's bronze-tipped prow. A properly executed ram could send a vessel to the depths within minutes, but it wasn't as simple as charging forward. Timing, angle and coordination were critically important. Too sharp an approach and you'd deflect off. Too direct and you might embed your ship in theirs, leaving both vessels exposed. Successful ramming fleets employed complex manoeuvres like the Diekplaus and Periplus. In a Diekplaus, a ship would dash through gaps in enemy lines, then rotate to strike from behind. The Periplus involved encircling the enemy formation to hit exposed flanks. These weren't brute force tactics. They were precision strikes dependent on rower synchronization and captain foresight. But sometimes plans failed. Rams missed, ships entangled, oars shattered. That's when backup plans activated. Boarding. Boarding transformed naval fighting into land-style combat. Once two ships collided or locked, Marines would leap aboard enemy vessels with swords, spears and shields. These weren't delicate encounters. Boarding was savage, close-quarters combat, more like gang warfare than organised phalanx fighting. Archers and slingers added chaos from upper decks, targeting anyone showing excessive helmet. Some fleets, like Rome's, eventually preferred boarding over ramming. They even constructed special devices like the Corvus, a boarding plank with a spike that could latch onto enemy ships and convert sea battles into floating land fights. This tactic helped Rome defeat more experienced Carthaginian sailors during the First Punic War. Because what Romans lacked in seamanship they compensated for with sheer infantry power. Naturally, this also meant naval battles became bloodier and more chaotic. There was no retreat once boarding commenced. It was kill or die on a deck slippery with salt water, blood and broken timber. If ramming was ancient naval warfare's scalpel, then fire was its sledgehammer. Nothing was more terrifying than a blazing ship approaching your fleet. Fire ships were the naval world's version of controlled chaos, a weapon so dangerous that it frequently threatened attackers as much as enemies. Though not as common as triremes or boarding actions, fire tactics appeared early and developed over time. The basic principle was straightforward. Load a ship with combustible materials, pitch, tar, sulfur, resin, oil, and ignite it before directing it toward enemy vessels. Ideally, the fire ship would drift into tightly packed enemy lines, igniting sails, decks, and anything flammable. One of the earliest documented fire ship uses comes from the Greco-Persian conflicts where desperate defenders attempted to repel naval invasions by hurling flaming rafts or boats toward enemy galleys. In confined spaces of harbours or straits where manoeuvrability was restricted, a single fire ship could cause mass panic and shatter formations. But fire at sea was double-edged. Winds could shift, flames could reverse direction. A poorly timed fire ship could destroy your own fleet as easily as the enemy's. This is why fire was often reserved for desperate moments, blockades, surprise attacks, or final stands where risk justified havoc. The most sophisticated development in ancient incendiary warfare came with Greek fire, a mysterious and fearsome weapon developed by the Byzantine Empire centuries later, but inspired by ancient fire tactics. Greek fire could allegedly burn on water and couldn't be extinguished with conventional methods. While it's more medieval than ancient, its conceptual origins, chemical fire used for naval dominance, can be traced back to these early fire ships. Egyptian and Phoenician fleets also used variations of fire-based weapons, particularly against pirate vessels and during sieges. For instance, coastal defenders might catapult firepots or flaming arrows onto ships attempting to breach harbours. The psychological effect of fire at sea was unmatched. A ram could be blocked, a boarding could be repelled, but fire-panicked crews, devoured wooden hulls and spread faster than orders could be shouted. Even the most experienced sailors might abandon ship at the first scent of pitch and smoke. In the 5th century BCE, Athens transformed itself from a landlocked city-state into a dominant naval superpower, and it all began with silver. When a massive silver vein was discovered in the Laurium mines, Themistocles, an ambitious Athenian politician, convinced his fellow citizens not to divide the wealth but to invest it. His plan? Build a fleet of triremes, many of them. That decision changed history. With over 200 warships at its peak, the Athenian navy became the backbone of what we now call the Athenian Empire. The city's power was no longer rooted in hoplite infantry or stone walls. It sailed on wood, sweat, and strategy. The victory at Salamis in 480 BCE, where Themistocles' fleet trapped and annihilated the Persian navy in narrow straits, remains one of the most decisive sea battles of the ancient world. That win didn't just preserve Athens, it positioned it as the protector and soon ruler of the Aegean. Under the Delian League, Athens began extracting tribute from allied city-states, supposedly for mutual naval defence. In practice, this tribute was often used to fund Athens' own interests, from shipbuilding to public architecture. The navy allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project its power far beyond its borders. But it wasn't just about military might. The fleet democratized Athens. The poorest citizens who couldn't afford armour or land to fight as hoplites became essential rowers in the triremes. Their contribution gave them political influence, transforming the Athenian assembly and empowering the lower classes. Sea power became people power. However, this dominance came at a cost. Athens' over-reliance on its navy and its coercive treatment of allies bred resentment during the Peloponnesian War. Sparta, historically a land-based power, built its own fleet with Persian money and eventually crushed the Athenian navy at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. With its fleet gone, Athens was starved into surrender. Still, the legacy of Athenian naval power endured. It demonstrated that a city-state with limited land could become an imperial force through mastery of the sea. It also proved that ships could be political tools just as much as weapons. If Athens ruled the Aegean, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 800 BCE in what is now Tunisia, Carthage built its power not on conquest alone, but on trade, seafaring, and unmatched naval innovation. By the 4th century BCE, Carthage wasn't just a wealthy city. It was the nerve centre of a sprawling maritime network that stretched from Spain to Sicily and North Africa to Sardinia. Carthaginian power was made possible by its fleet. While the Athenians refined the trireme, the Carthaginians took naval engineering to industrial levels. Their shipyards, especially the vast circular harbour of Carthage, could build and house hundreds of warships. These weren't theoretical numbers. Carthage had an assembly line-style dock system that allowed for rapid construction and repair, something unprecedented in the ancient world. Carthaginian ships, often quadriremes or quinqueremes, were heavier than Athenian triremes, designed not just for speed but for power. Their naval doctrine leaned toward ramming and boarding, supported by experienced mercenary marines and Libyan Phoenician sailors who had grown up on the sea. The city's maritime dominance wasn't only about force, it was about commerce. Carthaginian merchants navigated the Atlantic coasts of Europe and Africa, traded tin and silver, and brought back exotic goods. The navy ensured that pirates, rival traders, or Roman ambitions didn't interfere with this lucrative flow. And then came the Punic Wars. Rome, rising in the Italian peninsula, recognized that defeating Carthage meant building a navy from scratch. When they captured a stranded Carthaginian quinquereme, they reverse-engineered it, complete with the Corvus, a boarding ramp that neutralized Carthage's superior seamanship by turning sea battles into land skirmishes. Despite early defeats, Carthage held its own through brilliant naval commanders and tactical mastery. In the First Punic War, the Carthaginians fought dozens of major sea battles. At Drepana, they executed a flawless maneuver that destroyed a Roman fleet despite being outnumbered, proving Carthage still knew how to command the sea. But quantity eventually overwhelmed quality. Roman persistence, better supply lines and brutal discipline turned the tide. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's fleet was gone, its shipyards dismantled and its power broken. Still, the legend of Carthaginian naval dominance endures. They weren't just warriors on the water, they were master merchants, innovative shipbuilders and bold navigators who once ruled the seas through wit, wealth and wood. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids, pharaohs and temples, not fleets. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to embrace naval power, both on the Nile and at sea. Its ships may not have been as famous as Greek triremes or Carthaginian quinqueremes, but for thousands of years Egypt relied on watercraft to maintain its empire, transport troops, and protect its economic lifelines. The Nile was Egypt's highway, an artery that connected north and south, desert and delta. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian shipbuilders were crafting vessels from bundled papyrus reeds and later cedarwood imported from Lebanon. These riverboats transported grain, gold, soldiers, and even colossal statues. Pharaohs led naval expeditions southward into Nubia and eastward across the Red Sea to Punt, a mysterious land rich in incense, ivory, and exotic animals. But Egypt's naval ambitions weren't limited to the river. By the time of the New Kingdom, c. 1550–1070 BCE, Egypt developed seagoing fleets capable of challenging pirates, repelling invasions and projecting power beyond its borders. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Rameses III, Egypt used warships in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders who threatened the eastern Mediterranean. These battles, recorded in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, show Egyptian archers firing from ships and marines engaging in brutal close combat aboard narrow wooden decks. Unlike the oared triremes of Greece, Egyptian seagoing ships were broad, sail-driven vessels with limited manoeuvrability. They often featured raised fighting platforms and were crewed by archers, spearmen and sailors trained in both combat and navigation. Their primary advantage was mobility along coasts and rivers where they could rapidly deploy soldiers or intercept merchant traffic. Egyptian naval strength also underpinned its economy. Grain exports to the Levant and trade with the Aegean were secured by escort ships. Ports like Byblos and Tanis became hubs of both commerce and naval logistics. Even foreign rulers sought Egyptian shipbuilders for their craftsmanship. In time, Egypt's naval power waned under successive waves of foreign rule: Libyans, Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Greeks and Romans. But its long legacy of riverine and coastal warfare set the foundation for naval traditions in the ancient Near East. Egypt's ships may not have ruled the open sea, but they ruled the rhythm of empire, sailing where the Nile flowed, where the winds allowed, and where power demanded. When the Roman Republic first rose to prominence, it was not a naval power. Rome's strength lay in its disciplined legions and road-building prowess, not shipbuilding. But that changed dramatically and rapidly when the Republic found itself in a bitter contest for control of the Mediterranean against Carthage. The result was one of the most dramatic naval transformations in ancient history. At the start of the First Punic War, 264 BCE, Rome had almost no fleet. Carthage, meanwhile, had centuries of maritime dominance. But the Romans weren't deterred. According to legend, they captured a Carthaginian quinquereme and used it as a prototype. Within months, they mass-produced a navy, assembling hundreds of ships through sheer manpower and state-level organisation. But Rome knew it couldn't outsail the Carthaginians. So it changed the rules of the game. Enter the Corvus, a boarding bridge fitted with a metal spike. This device turned sea battles into infantry brawls, Rome's specialty. With it, Roman marines could board enemy ships en masse, transforming naval combat into something far more familiar to Roman soldiers. The outcomes were extraordinary. In confrontations like Maille and Cape Ecnomus, Rome's green sailors overcame seasoned Carthaginian naval forces through pure determination and the brutal efficiency of the Corvus boarding device. Over time, the Corvus fell out of use. It created dangerous instability, making vessels precariously unbalanced, yet it had already shifted the war's momentum. When the Second Punic War arrived, Rome's maritime capabilities had evolved significantly. Roman fleets dominated the western Mediterranean, securing supply chains to Spain and North Africa, while cutting off Hannibal's reinforcement routes from Carthage. Maritime sieges and seaborne assaults became routine imperial strategies. Roman naval dominance extended even further. The classis Missinensis and classis Ravanatis served as primary imperial squadrons, positioned to secure commercial routes, eliminate piracy, and move legions across the empire. While not always leading military campaigns, these fleets provided crucial logistical and tactical support, maintaining imperial connectivity. Unlike Athens or Carthage, Rome never developed a seafaring culture. It treated the ocean as an instrument, something to be conquered when required. Still, by the 1st century of the Common Era, the Mare Nostrum, our sea, represented more than mere bragging. It was actual fact. Rome might have emerged from terrestrial origins, but its fate was determined on the waves. Through flexibility, ingenuity, and unwavering determination, it transformed the Mediterranean from a weakness into a stronghold. Ancient maritime combat didn't merely decide battles. It determined boundaries, trade systems, empires, and civilizations throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Mastery of the seas meant far more than naval victories. It meant authority over the flow of concepts, commerce, languages, and political systems that would resonate through centuries. Consider first how naval forces built empires. Athens achieved cultural and economic dominance through maritime strength. Carthage converted oceanic mastery into commercial empire. Rome, despite beginning late in naval warfare, leveraged sea power to dominate the entire Mediterranean region. All these powers possessed land forces, yet their fleets enabled them to project power across continents, protect remote territories, and strangle enemy trade. The ocean also functioned as a cultural highway. Greek settlers sailed to establish colonies throughout Italy and Asia Minor, disseminating artistic traditions, religious beliefs, and language. Egyptian vessels carried papyrus, precious metals, and sacred wisdom to distant kingdoms. Phoenician sailors transmitted their writing system and deities to virtually every coastline they encountered. Naval strength was never purely military, it was civilizational force. Technologically, ancient fleets drove shipbuilding innovation to unprecedented levels. Creating the trireme and subsequent larger warships represented more than military progress. It constituted an engineering revolution. Ports evolved into logistical centres, navigational methods advanced. Standardized vessel designs established foundations for maritime engineering, evident later in Byzantine and Islamic naval traditions. Economic structures themselves transformed because of naval power. Secure sea lanes enabled reliable long-distance trade, allowing luxury items like silk, spices, wine, and dyes to travel between distant civilizations. Cities with powerful fleets like Alexandria or Rhodes became prosperous cosmopolitan centres. Where naval forces flourished, so did markets, artists, scholars, and innovators. Then there was the psychological impact. Fire ships, ramming manoeuvres, boarding assaults, these tactics left permanent marks on how warfare was conceived. They established the concept that the sea itself could become a weapon, that manoeuvrability and dominance rather than mere brute strength could determine conflicts. Today we recall many empires for their territorial conquests. But their maritime achievements were equally crucial and often more lasting. Ancient naval warfare wasn't simply about possessing the swiftest vessels or sharpest rams. It concerned who grasped the ocean as a theatre not merely for war, but for history itself. Ultimately, the triremes have vanished, but their influence continues rippling through time. Cyrus the Great entered the world around 600 BCE in Anshan, then a tributary kingdom under Median authority. His lineage, the Achaemenids, claimed aristocratic heritage and governed a modest but respected Persian territory. Yet nothing in Cyrus's early years suggested he would eventually forge one of history's most expansive empires. Still, from his earliest days, mythology surrounded him. Greek chronicler Herodotus provides one of antiquity's most compelling origin narratives. According to Herodotus, Median king Astyages, Cyrus's grandfather, experienced a prophetic dream that his daughter's offspring would dethrone him. Dream interpreters validated his deepest fears. The child would pose a danger to his rule. So Astyages arranged his daughter Mandane's marriage to Persian nobleman Cambyses the Faj, believing the baby would remain politically irrelevant. Yet the visions continued. When Cyrus was born, Astyages took decisive action. He commanded faithful servant Harpagus to eliminate the infant. Harpagus, unwilling to perform such a deed, passed the horrible responsibility to a shepherd. Instead of leaving the baby to die, the shepherd adopted Cyrus as his own, concealing him in the highlands and raising him like any herder's child. As Cyrus matured, his natural leadership emerged. Even as a youth, he distinguished himself, leading other children, demonstrating authority beyond his age. Eventually, whispers reached the royal court. A noble child living among shepherds. Astyages investigated and discovered the truth. Surprisingly, he allowed Cyrus to live, perhaps seeing no immediate danger, or perhaps feeling remorse. Harpagus, however, faced terrible retribution. In brutal punishment, Astyages executed Harpagus's son and served the flesh at a court feast. Meanwhile, Cyrus returned to Persia to live under his father Cambyses' protection, now openly acknowledged as a prince of royal lineage. The Median ruler failed to realize he had just guaranteed his own destruction. For Cyrus, experience among both shepherds and nobility provided him unique insight into humanity, understanding both the mighty and the humble. Whether Herodotus's account represents truth or legend, the tale captures the mystique that would forever encompass Cyrus. From near death in childhood to fate-defying survival, his formative years sowed the foundations of greatness. He would not merely confront Astyages, but revolutionize rulership itself. By the middle of the 6th century BCE, Cyrus had evolved beyond a simple Persian prince. He had become a shrewd and ambitious leader prepared to upset the regional order. During this period, the Median Empire under King Astyages still controlled Persia, but power dynamics were changing and Cyrus was positioned to alter the balance. The trigger was treachery. According to various accounts, including Herodotus and the Babylonian Chronicle, Median general Harpagus, the same man previously ordered to kill infant Cyrus, had never forgotten his son's cruel death. Now, years later, he possessed the means to retaliate secretly. He dispatched communications to Cyrus, urging rebellion and promising internal Median support. It marked the start of an uprising that would transform the ancient world. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus formally revolted. Persia, formerly a vassal state, now proclaimed independence and initiated warfare. What ensued wasn't one climactic battle, but extended military campaigns. Across 3 years, Cyrus's armies advanced into Median lands, gaining backing from dissatisfied nobles and regional partners. His reputation expanded not only for tactical skill but for mercy. He frequently spared defeated enemies' lives, inspiring both terror and respect. Meanwhile, Astyages' court was disintegrating. Allegiance crumbled. When the ultimate showdown occurred around 550 BCE, victory belonged not to the Medes, but to Cyrus. Astyages was betrayed by his own forces, and the once dominant Median Empire collapsed almost instantly. Cyrus entered Ecbatana, the Median capital, not as a savage conqueror, but as a revolutionary type of ruler. He honoured local customs, maintained Median governmental systems, and integrated numerous Medes into his expanding administration. This inclusive approach would characterise his reign. With Media subdued, Cyrus united the Iranian highlands. But this wasn't the conclusion. It was the opening. By defeating the Medes, he not only freed Persia from subordination, but also inherited their empire. He now commanded territories extending from modern Iran to portions of Central Asia. Following his victory over the Medes, Cyrus the Great directed his attention westward toward the extraordinarily wealthy Lydian kingdom, governed by the renowned Croesus. Croesus was an exceptional monarch. He ranked among his era's wealthiest individuals, his name synonymous with enormous riches. His capital, Sardis, sparkled with opulence, and his forces were well armed with elite cavalry and veteran soldiers. Yet Croesus committed a critical error. He misjudged Cyrus's capabilities. Attempting to prevent Persian expansion, Croesus established alliances with Egypt and Babylon and sought guidance from the Delphic oracle. The oracle famously prophesied that crossing the Halys River to attack Persia would result in destroying a great empire. Emboldened, Croesus launched his invasion, only to learn that the empire destined for destruction was his own. The armies met near the Halys River in 547 BCE. Following an intensely fought engagement, Croesus retreated to Sardis, assuming the fighting season had concluded and planning to reorganize in spring with allied reinforcements. But Cyrus executed an unexpected strategy: pursuit. In an audacious winter offensive, Cyrus surrounded Sardis, forcing Croesus into desperate resistance. According to Herodotus, Cyrus even deployed tactical innovation. He utilized camels to frighten Lydian cavalry, Croesus's primary advantage, neutralizing their effectiveness. Within weeks, Sardis capitulated. Croesus was taken prisoner. What followed next established Cyrus's reputation as an unprecedented ruler. Rather than executing Croesus, Cyrus allegedly pardoned him, even appointing him as an advisor. Legend states that as Croesus faced execution by fire, he called out Solon's name, a Greek sage who once warned against considering anyone fortunate until knowing their life's end. Cyrus, touched by this story and its wisdom, reportedly halted the execution. Whether historical fact or myth, this account reflects Cyrus's documented policy of clemency. With Lydia's conquest, Cyrus acquired control over its vast wealth and commercial networks, plus the influential Greek city-states of Ionia along the Aegean coastline. Though the Ionian cities opposed Persian authority, they couldn't match Cyrus's growing military and diplomatic apparatus. Croesus's downfall represented more than a rich kingdom's collapse. It demonstrated Cyrus's tactical genius and willingness to combine warfare with mercy. It also established Persia's presence in the Greek sphere, laying groundwork for future East-West confrontations. For Cyrus, it represented another step in his rapidly expanding empire. By the late 540s BCE, only one major force stood between Cyrus and absolute Near Eastern supremacy: Babylon. Once ruled by kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had developed into a spectacular metropolis famous for its soaring ziggurats, enormous double fortifications, and the legendary Hanging Gardens. But beneath the magnificence, weaknesses were emerging. At this time, Babylon was governed by Nabonidus, a king deeply despised by his subjects. His religious reforms alienated the influential priests of Marduk, the city's primary god. He had spent years absent from Babylon, leaving imperial affairs to his son Belshazzar, a figure known to Hebrew Bible readers. Popular dissatisfaction was mounting. Cyrus recognized the opportunity. In 539 BCE, Cyrus initiated his campaign. But unlike earlier invasions characterized by siege warfare and devastation, this operation was precise. Cyrus's forces defeated Babylonian troops at Opis, a strategic city along the Tigris. Their victory came not only through military might, but through effective messaging. The Persians pledged to free the population from Nabonidus' oppressive rule, presenting Cyrus as a restorer of divine justice. Most remarkably, when Cyrus approached Babylon, he encountered no resistance. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and subsequent Greek accounts, the city gates opened for him, possibly through political arrangements, possibly due to internal conspiracy. Regardless, Cyrus entered Babylon as a liberator, not a destroyer. He honoured the city's religious sites, joined in ceremonial observances, and proclaimed in the famous Cyrus Cylinder that Marduk had selected him to restore peace and righteousness. This document, frequently called humanity's first human rights charter, records Cyrus's policies of religious tolerance, temple reconstruction, and repatriation of exiled populations. Among those affected were Jews displaced from Jerusalem decades earlier by Babylonian rulers. Cyrus issued a decree permitting their return home and temple reconstruction in Jerusalem, an act so meaningful that Hebrew scripture calls him God's anointed, a designation normally reserved for Israelite monarchs. After entering Babylon in 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great didn't simply claim the throne, he transformed imperial governance. One of his reign's most significant artifacts is the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document inscribed in Akkadian script, frequently celebrated as humanity's first human rights charter. While contemporary historians debate this characterization, the cylinder undoubtedly provides a groundbreaking perspective on how Cyrus understood authority, not as oppression, but as guardianship. The text presents Cyrus as Marduk's chosen instrument, Babylon's chief deity, to restore order and justice following Nabonidus' misrule. But this wasn't empty rhetoric. Cyrus supported his proclamations with concrete actions. He revitalized temples to proper functioning, permitted displaced peoples to return to their ancestral lands, and explicitly declared he would not oppress subjects or modify their traditional practices. One of the most celebrated consequences of this policy was Jewish liberation from Babylonian captivity. After decades in exile, Jewish people were authorized to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct their destroyed temple. The Book of Ezra in Hebrew scripture records Cyrus's edict, praising him as an agent of divine purpose, extraordinary recognition for a foreign ruler. In fact, Cyrus remains the only non-Jewish figure ever designated as Messiah or Anointed One in the Bible. The Cyrus Cylinder employs language of liberation, restoration, and legitimacy through justice. This sharply contrasted typical ancient royal rhetoric, which usually glorified conquest and divine retribution. Instead of celebrating city destruction or enemy enslavement, Cyrus emphasized his role protecting diverse cultures and faiths. This wasn't weakness, it was calculated strategy. By respecting local traditions, he prevented rebellion and cultivated loyalty throughout his vast dominion. While we must avoid imposing modern legal concepts on ancient texts, the Cyrus Cylinder's spirit remains extraordinary. It envisions governance where rulers derive authority not from intimidation, but from benevolence and inclusivity. Today, a cylinder replica is housed at United Nations headquarters, testifying to its symbolic significance as an early model for pluralistic leadership. Cyrus the Great didn't merely conquer an enormous empire, he maintained its unity. This might appear straightforward theoretically, but in practice he governed incredibly diverse populations: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, Lydians, Hebrews, and numerous others, each with distinct languages, religions, customs, and grievances. What made Cyrus genuinely great wasn't how extensively he expanded borders, but how expertly he administered what lay within them. Central to Cyrus's governance was tolerance through organization. Unlike many ancient rulers who forced their culture and religion upon conquered populations, Cyrus embraced decentralized administration. He permitted local authorities to remain in position, local religions to prosper, and local customs to persist. Rather than crushing subjects into compliance, he sought to earn their confidence. The strategy succeeded. He preserved and modified Median and Babylonian administrative structures, merging them with Persian methods to create an exceptionally adaptable empire. Authority was distributed to satraps, or regional governors, who supervised taxation, security, and justice in their provinces. These officials were typically selected from local aristocracy, but remained answerable to Cyrus's central government. This framework became the foundation of Achaemenid rule for generations. Cyrus also developed infrastructure. He enhanced trade routes, protected merchant caravans, and ensured equitable treatment for traders. He understood commerce was as vital to stability as military force. His empire wasn't merely a war machine. It was an economic and cultural network spanning from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. He also grasped symbolic power. In every conquered city, Cyrus demonstrated respect, reconstructing temples, participating in religious rituals, and preserving local institutions. These actions weren't simply performative. They were diplomatic tactics that secured former enemies' loyalty. Most remarkably, his rule generated minimal resistance. Cyrus didn't just prevent rebellions, he frequently inspired admiration. Even Greeks, typically contemptuous of barbarians, regarded him as wise and just. Xenophon, the Athenian chronicler, later wrote the Cyropaedia, a partially fictional but deeply respectful biography of Cyrus, portraying him as the ideal of enlightened governance. By his reign's end, Cyrus the Great had transformed the ancient world. From the Aegean Sea to Central Asian mountains, his empire extended farther than any predecessor. But like many great conquerors, his ambition drove him toward one final expedition, this time into the northeastern steppes. It would be his final campaign. Around 530 BCE, Cyrus departed to face the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes living east of the Caspian Sea. The nomadic warriors who rode across the steppes followed Queen Tomyris, a sovereign who stood as both battlefield commander and emblem of resistance. The Persians viewed her people as barbaric yet formidable, posing a real danger to their empire's expanding frontiers. The campaign's specifics remain unclear, filtered through Herodotus's theatrical and probably exaggerated narrative. The Greek chronicler tells us that Cyrus initially tried negotiation, offering marriage to Queen Tomyris. She recognized this transparent attempt at political manipulation. When negotiations collapsed, Cyrus turned to deception. He abandoned a feast of wine and sumptuous food, understanding that the Massagetæ had little experience with strong drink. Following their intoxicated revelry, many warriors fell into an ambush and were massacred, her son among the victims. Grief-stricken and furious, Tomyris vowed revenge. In the decisive confrontation that ensued, the Massagetæ crushed the Persian army. Cyrus fell in battle. Herodotus goes so far as to claim that Tomyris beheaded his corpse and thrust his severed head into a wineskin filled with blood, proclaiming, "Satisfy yourself with blood, you who craved it so deeply." Though this grisly conclusion might be legend rather than history, one thing remains undisputed. Cyrus perished during this expedition, far from the magnificent cities he had captured. His remains were eventually transported back to Pasargadae, the capital he established in Persia, and interred in an understated yet dignified sepulchre that stands today as proof of his enduring influence. His death concluded an epoch. Power transferred to his son Cambyses II, who would advance the empire's growth, particularly into Egypt. Yet Cyrus's distinctive combination of acceptance, tactical brilliance, and forward-thinking governance would prove nearly impossible to duplicate. Upon Cyrus the Great's death, he bequeathed more than a sprawling empire. He left a governing framework, a moral foundation, and a legacy so honoured that even generations later his reputation commanded reverence. The Achaemenid realm that Cyrus established became the largest the world had witnessed, spanning from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. But scale alone didn't define its significance. What mattered was its operation. Cyrus's principles of acceptance, tolerance, and administrative reform persisted under his heirs. His son Cambyses II and subsequently Darius the Great didn't merely enlarge the empire, they institutionalized its framework. The provincial system Cyrus developed became fundamental to imperial administration. These territorial administrators maintained order, gathered tribute, and reported directly to the monarch, enabling the empire to stay both extensive and remarkably effective. Religious and cultural liberty remained official doctrine. Sacred sites and native gods received respect throughout the realm, from Babylonian temples to Egyptian shrines. Local aristocrats often retained authority under Persian supervision. Uprisings were uncommon in the early Achaemenid era, not from terror, but because many subjects discovered Persian governance less harsh than the systems they had previously endured. Cyrus also established the concept of rulership as a moral obligation, not merely political authority. He wasn't simply king of Persia. He adopted titles such as King of the Four Corners of the Earth. But unlike the arrogant despots of earlier times, his authority derived from his subjects' welfare. This wasn't mere propaganda. It represented a genuine transformation in imperial thinking. Effective leadership was integral to greatness. Even after death, Cyrus's impact endured. His tomb at Pasargadae, a modest limestone monument, symbolized both humility and permanence. Alexander the Great, himself an empire builder, centuries afterward visited Cyrus's grave and reportedly honoured it, commanding its repair after Vandals damaged it in Persia. Cyrus wasn't merely remembered, he was venerated. Subsequent Persian dynasties invoked his legacy to validate their own authority. Zoroastrian clerics linked him with divine righteousness. Iranian national consciousness still celebrates him as the country's founder. Cyrus the Great's influence didn't cease with his passing or even his empire's collapse. Through the ages, his legacy expanded beyond boundaries, religions, and civilizations, establishing him not just as a Persian champion, but as a universally respected figure whose model resonated across time. In Hebrew scripture, Cyrus appears not as a heathen despot, but as a divinely chosen liberator. The Book of Isaiah calls him the Lord's Anointed, a designation typically reserved for Israelite monarchs. His proclamation permitting Jewish exile to return to Jerusalem and reconstruct the temple represented a pivotal moment in Jewish chronicles. For many, he remains a righteous outsider, a rare instance of a mighty ruler who employed his strength to rebuild, not demolish, faith and liberty. In Greece, despite generations of warfare with Persia, Cyrus was frequently depicted as the perfect sovereign. The Athenian author Xenophon, Socrates' pupil, composed the Cyropaedia, a semi-fictional biography of Cyrus's life that portrayed him as the ideal leader, intelligent, fair, temperate, and courageous. Though not strictly historical, it influenced Hellenistic and Roman concepts of governance and morality for centuries. In Islamic scholarship, some theologians and interpreters have connected Cyrus with Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one referenced in the Quran, a virtuous king who constructed a massive barrier to shield people from disorder and oppression. While this connection remains disputed, it demonstrates the esteem Cyrus enjoys across Abrahamic faiths. Contemporary historians and political figures have also drawn inspiration from Cyrus. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson allegedly kept the Cyropaedia beside his bed. During the 20th century, Iran's final Shah referenced Cyrus as a symbol of national cohesion and progress. Today, Cyrus's cylinder, frequently called humanity's first human rights charter, is exhibited at the United Nations as an emblem of tolerance and governance. Cyrus's attraction extends beyond conquest. He's remembered not for brutality or empire building exclusively, but for his exceptional capacity to exercise power with fairness. He demonstrated that an empire didn't need to eliminate diversity to maintain authority, and that rulers could earn devotion through respect rather than intimidation. More than 20 centuries later, Cyrus the Great remains an enigma. A conqueror celebrated for his mercy, a king lauded by those he subdued. Few historical figures command such broad admiration, and even fewer merit it. Under the scorching sun of the Nile Valley, ancient Egyptians made a striking decision. Most of them removed all their hair. But this wasn't purely practical. It was symbolic, a declaration, a blank slate. And on that slate, they positioned some of the most sophisticated wigs the ancient world ever witnessed. Wigs in ancient Egypt weren't simply fashionable, they were crucial indicators of identity, rank, and cleanliness. Elite men and women didn't just wear them, they displayed them proudly. These weren't basic accessories either. They could be crafted from genuine human hair, imported horsehair, or delicately woven plant materials. Wealthy aristocrats frequently ordered wigs with several tiers, complex braiding, golden ornaments, and even scented cones positioned on top, wax-based fragrances that would gradually dissolve in the heat, enveloping them in luxury. For women, hairstyles connected to femininity, fertility, and authority. A noblewoman's wig might feature floral embellishments, vibrant ribbons, or precious metal fasteners. A priestess might style hers in precise, balanced rows, reflecting the divine harmony of the gods. For men, particularly those serving Pharaoh, a full, elaborate wig demonstrated not just prosperity but proximity to divine authority. Children, meanwhile, had their own fashion. Many sported the youth lock, a shaved scalp with one decorative braid remaining, a childhood symbol that would be removed during maturity or religious ceremonies. And then there were the hairless priests. In stark opposition to the extravagance of royal wigs, priests were obligated to remove all body hair, including their scalps, to preserve ritual cleanliness. During public ceremonies, however, even they might don ceremonial wigs representing their spiritual duties rather than personal identity. What's most intriguing is how wigs functioned beyond death. Mummies were frequently entombed with wigs intact, guaranteeing their status, and beauty continued into the afterlife. Hair, essentially, wasn't mere vanity, it was perpetual identity. When you envision a Viking, you probably see untamed beards and braided hair, an image created from archaeology, Norse legends, and Hollywood combined. But there's surprising accuracy in that picture. Viking hairstyles were anything but random. Indeed, hair served as a potent symbol in Norse culture of identity, manhood, tribal allegiance, and even attraction. Both Viking men and women regarded their hair seriously. In a society where physical appearance conveyed strength and dignity, long hair wasn't vanity, it was a statement. Men frequently cultivated lengthy hair and styled it carefully. Braids, knots, and partially shaved heads weren't merely fashionable, they were menacing. A warrior entering combat with braided hair and a thick beard wasn't just being practical, keeping hair from his vision. He was announcing his battle readiness and fearlessness. For Viking women, hair carried equal symbolism. Long, well-maintained hair indicated femininity and elevated status. Women often braided their hair in intricate designs, sometimes incorporating ribbons or beads within the strands. A married woman might bind her hair or partially conceal it to indicate her marital state, similar to how wedding bands function now. Some Scandinavian burial grounds even contain combs, hairpins, and grooming implements, indicating that daily maintenance and appearance pride mattered to both genders. There was also a compelling legal dimension. In Viking legal systems, hair held judicial significance. Forcibly cutting someone's hair was deemed a serious offence, one that could trigger vengeance, legal action, or complete blood feuds. That's because hair embodied honor. To humiliate a warrior by severing his locks was to assault his social position directly. And then there's Norse mythology. The gods themselves possessed distinctive hair. Thor with his fiery red beard. Loki's shape-shifting pranks frequently involved hair or form alterations. And naturally, the goddess Sif, whose golden locks were so renowned that when Loki severed them as a joke, he had to plead with the dwarfs to create a magical substitute from actual gold. Hair wasn't just mortal identity, it was divine treasure. The Romans understood control thoroughly, and this included their hairstyles. In a civilization where politics, social class, and gender were strictly regulated, hair became one of the most subtle yet influential instruments of social maneuvering, particularly among the elite. Your appearance could literally announce your loyalty, principles, and aspirations. Let's begin with Roman men. During the early Republic, the ideal Roman citizen appeared neat, traditional, and functional. Hair was cropped, orderly, and well-groomed. Anything lengthier was viewed suspiciously, feminine, foreign, or indolent. A short haircut and clean-shaven face weren't just style preferences, they were civic declarations. They proclaimed, "I'm disciplined, I serve the Republic, I'm Roman." But as the empire developed, things became more elaborate. Emperors like Nero and Commodus allowed their curls to grow in ostentatious styles that imitated Greek scholars or divine sculptures. Some wore what we now term the Roman crest, an elevated section of curled or arranged hair at the forehead, shaped to suggest wisdom, youthfulness, or sophistication. These weren't coincidental, they were deliberately constructed public personas. Hair became political messaging. For Roman women, the consequences were even greater. Hairstyles became genuinely architectural. The celebrated Flavian Tower design, a literal peak of curls and braids stacked above the head, was a high-status appearance, achievable only through enslaved labour, heated tools, and countless hours of effort. The more complex the hairstyle, the more affluent the woman, because it demonstrated she possessed the free time and servants to sustain it. Hair could also display political allegiance. Empresses frequently introduced new styles through statues and imperial currency, which upper-class women throughout the empire then imitated. Adopting an empress's hairstyle wasn't just admiration, it was loyalty. Meanwhile, enslaved individuals were typically required to maintain short or simple hair, preventing them from this form of self-expression entirely. Soldiers similarly wore practical cuts, emphasizing unity and purpose over style. And then there were the dissidents. Some Romans intentionally cultivated long hair or embraced barbarian styles to express contempt for imperial customs. For instance, gladiators frequently wore striking hairstyles to create stage identities, part athlete, part celebrity, part menace. In ancient Japan, hair wasn't simply a personal characteristic, it was a symbol of discipline, obligation, and profound tradition. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the famous shonmeige, the distinctive top knot worn by samurai. This wasn't merely a hairstyle, it was a cultural commitment. Initially, the shonmeige served practical purposes. The shaved crown made helmets, especially the kabuto samurai wore helmets, more comfortable and stable during combat. But gradually, as tranquility prevailed during the Edo period, the style became less about warfare and more about identity. The top knot evolved into a rigid symbol of warrior rank, honor, and devotion. To Bushido, the warrior's path, removing it wasn't just a haircut, it was symbolic execution. A dishonored samurai might be commanded to cut his top knot, or perform it himself as acknowledgement that he was no longer deserving of his position. In severe cases, top knot removal preceded seppuku, the ceremonial suicide conducted to atone for disgrace. Japanese women's hair also communicated powerful social meanings. During the Heian era, noble women cultivated extraordinarily long hair, sometimes exceeding their body length, allowing it to flow straight down their backs in a style called subarashi. This wasn't merely aesthetic, it represented grace, patience, and position. Maintaining such length demanded enormous care, time, and resources, qualities exclusive to the nobility. Later, during the Edo period, women's hairstyles grew increasingly ornate and stylized. Styles like the shimada, a type of coiled arrangement, were decorated with pins, combs, and ornaments, each carrying specific meaning. Particular styles revealed marital status, age, or even occupation. Courtesans and geishas, for example, employed dazzling and elaborate hairstyles not only to captivate clients but to communicate their education, level, and expertise. Hair could also express defiance. During certain shogunate periods, regulations were enacted restricting hairstyles according to social class. Breaking these cultural codes, even something as simple as letting your hair grow in forbidden ways, could invite suspicion or severe punishment. Yet artists, performers, and masterless samurai called Ronin frequently pushed boundaries, using their appearance to make daring declarations about identity and defiance. In feudal Japan, hair carried both literal and symbolic weight through obligation, faith, and theatrical expression. From the quiet dignity worn by a samurai to the graceful spiral crowning a geisha's head, these elaborate styles told stories of honor, cultural heritage, and profound memory. Throughout ancient Africa, hair transcended personal fashion to become a sophisticated language. The detailed cornrows of Sahel communities to the magnificent coils worn by the Himba people served as identification markers, spiritual declarations, and tools for survival itself. Long before colonial interference disrupted these traditions, African hair culture flourished as an intricate weaving of meaning, artistry, and defiance. In Nubia, ancient Egypt's southern neighbour often overlooked by mainstream historical accounts, communities developed stylized braiding and twisting techniques that conveyed social standing, maturity, and tribal affiliation. Nubian royalty like Queens Amanitore and Amanisha Keto adorned themselves with elaborate braided wigs and ceremonial headpieces that matched even Egyptian magnificence, proclaiming their authority and beauty in striking, undeniable fashion. Moving westward to present-day Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo civilizations had already transformed hair into an artistic expression. Complex arrangements weren't merely decorative displays, they required careful planning, with specific designs designated for newlyweds, fighters, or religious devotees. Hairstylists commanded enormous respect, functioning almost like priests in their sacred duties. Allowing someone to handle your hair meant entrusting them with your very soul. Among Namibia's Himba people, red ochre paste created from ground stone and butterfat continues to be applied today to coat and shape intricate braided patterns. These ochre treatments don't simply shield hair from harsh desert conditions. They communicate everything, from adolescent transitions to marriage arrangements. For Himba women, hairstyles literally transform with life's changing seasons. The most captivating element of African hair traditions lies in how they preserved acts of resistance. During the horrific transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans employed hairstyles as silent methods of rebellion and remembrance. Cornrows served practical purposes, but they were also navigational aids. Certain designs symbolized freedom paths or secure gathering places. Others maintained ancestral traditions from homeland communities, refusing cultural erasure through every twist and weave. Across numerous West African societies, shaved scalps indicated grief or spiritual passages, while thick dreadlocks could signify power, divine connection, or warrior status. Hair held sacred meaning, never purely decorative. Colonial forces would later condemn these hairstyles, imposing European beauty standards. However, the ancient foundations of African hair culture remained unbroken. They survived through memory, through skilled hands, through braids transferred from mothers to daughters, and now experience worldwide revival. In ancient Greece, where marble sculptures and epic poetry influenced Western imagination, hair represented far more than personal maintenance. It became a public display of moral character, intelligence, and civilized behavior. From the tight curls worn by Athenian youth to the flowing locks of great thinkers, hairstyles helped establish your position before both divine beings and fellow citizens. Starting with men, early Greeks commonly wore lengthy hair secured with ribbons or bands. Epic heroes like Achilles and Odysseus are portrayed in verse as having lustrous or radiant hair, representing vigour, nobility, and heavenly blessing. During these ancient periods, long hair embodied masculine heroism. By the classical age, preferences had shifted. Well-maintained, reasonably short cuts became the preferred standard for Athenian men. Beards, however, remained essential. They represented the chosen combination for philosophers, political leaders, and educators. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all maintained beards, which suggested wisdom and experience, while clean foreheads and visible faces conveyed transparency and rational thought. Lengthy beards without wild, unkempt hair implied intellectual discipline over raw impulse, reason over pure emotion. Conversely, slaves and foreigners sometimes faced forced head-shaving as markers of subjugation or lower status. Strangely enough, possessing hair, particularly the appropriate type, became a form of political privilege. Women's hairstyles, meanwhile, connected deeply to household virtue. In public spaces, respectable women were required to wear hair pinned up and concealed, braided or twisted into neat buns. Loose flowing hair was typically saved for special ceremonies, especially mourning rituals or ecstatic religious observances, like Dionysian worship, where unrestrained hair represented departure from structure and social expectations. Young girls kept their hair down until reaching puberty, after which their initial braid was frequently cut and offered to Artemis during coming-of-age ceremonies. This gesture marked both childhood's end and the start of social obligations. Greek goddesses maintained distinctive hairstyles too. Athena's precisely arranged warrior helmet look symbolized tactical thinking and self-control. Aphrodite's cascading curls embodied sensuality and divine attraction. Hairstyles allowed mortals to connect with deities, adopting divine characteristics by copying their appearances. In ancient China, hair remained inseparable from ethical philosophy, family obligations, and imperial authority, from the sleek top-knots of Confucian academics to the elaborate arrangements of Tang Dynasty court women. Every strand fulfilled both aesthetic and symbolic functions. Hair wasn't to be modified carelessly. Actually, cutting it was frequently seen as a serious transgression. Why this reverence? Confucian filial devotion provided the answer. A fundamental principle of Confucianism held that your physical form, including hair, represented a sacred inheritance from your parents. Unnecessarily cutting, harming, or altering it demonstrated profound disrespect. This philosophy dominated Chinese society for generations. Even lawbreakers experienced head-shaving not merely as punishment but as ceremonial disgrace and spiritual separation. Men traditionally maintained long hair secured in top-knots or buns. Scholars, poets, and government officials typically combined this with flowing robes and caps, indicating wisdom, self-possession, and devotion to established order. Witnessing a man with dishevelled or loose hair in public spaces was deeply disturbing. It suggested mental illness, bereavement, or revolutionary tendencies. For women, hairstyles varied dramatically based on age and social position. Young girls frequently wore paired buns or side ponytails, indicating unmarried status. After wedding ceremonies, women's hair would be restructured into more sophisticated and formal designs, typically single coils or buns, secured with combs, jade accessories, or golden hairpins. Court ladies and empresses during Tang Dynasty rule elevated these arrangements to magnificent extremes, quite literally. Their hair was sculpted into towering constructions, decorated with phoenix pins, blossoms, and silk. Political power also influenced hair choices. Dynasty changes frequently imposed mandatory appearance modifications. When the Manchu-led Qing dynasty conquered Ming China, they mandated the queue hairstyle. The head's front section was shaved, while remaining hair was braided into a long pigtail. This arrangement became a despised symbol of surrender to foreign dominance. Many Han Chinese fought back, choosing death rather than what they perceived as cultural identity betrayal. In contrast, Taoist monks completely shaved their heads to abandon worldly concerns. Buddhist monks followed similar practices, showing their separation from material existence and acceptance of life's temporary nature. In ancient India, hair wasn't simply a physical characteristic, it held sacred significance. It connected with ceremonial purity, caste identification, and spiritual symbolism, becoming a powerful medium for both religious devotion and social hierarchy. From the tangled dreadlocks of holy men to the shaved scalps of pilgrims, hair within Indian culture communicated complex narratives of faith, self-discipline, and personal transformation. Beginning with sadhus, wandering religious figures who abandoned material life. Their hair was never trimmed, brushed, or restrained. Instead, they allowed it to develop into thick, matted dreadlocks called jata. These locks represented their spiritual authority and disconnection from worldly concerns. The longer and wilder the hair appeared, the stronger the message conveyed. This individual had risen above vanity, family ties, and personal ego. Sadhus modelled themselves after Lord Shiva, the deity of destruction and meditation, whose own jata supposedly contained the powerful Ganges River. For others, however, bare heads represented the pinnacle of holiness in Hindu practices. Pilgrims frequently shaved their heads before approaching sacred locations, presenting their hair as tokens of submission and spiritual cleansing. Children's initial haircuts, called mundan, served as crucial passage rituals believed to remove negative karma from past existences. Funeral customs also demanded close male family members to shave their heads, symbolizing humility and release from material attachments. Hair also revealed caste and marriage circumstances. Upper caste men traditionally maintained a single hair tuft at the crown, the shika, after shaving remaining areas. This top knot wasn't arbitrary. It identified them as twice-born, belonging to priestly or scholarly classes, and responsible for performing sacred ceremonies. Removing the shika without justification equaled social destruction. Women's hairstyles carried equal symbolic weight. Unmarried girls usually wore hair loose or in basic braids, while married women secured their hair in buns or coiled arrangements. Well-oiled, carefully braided styles indicated self-control, beauty, and family honour. Decoration differed by location and prosperity, but jasmine blossoms, golden clips, and ornamental combs were frequently displayed during celebrations and wedding ceremonies. Hair also connected to sensual energy. Ancient writings like the Kama Sutra detail alluring hair arrangements, while temple carvings at sites like Khajuraho show women with elaborately styled hair flowing down their backs like liquid art. Across the ancient world, hairstyles weren't only about conforming to expectations, they were also employed to distinguish oneself, resist authority, and rebel against systems. In numerous societies, altering or rejecting established hairstyles became acts of rebellion, whether subtle or bold, against cultural standards, imperial forces, or oppressive structures. In Roman-controlled Judea, Jewish communities, guided by strict religious law, rejected the ornate grooming preferred by Roman aristocrats. Many Jewish men refused to trim their beards or adopt Roman hairstyles, maintaining distinct identity rooted in spiritual observance. For them, hair wasn't about fashion trends, it represented religious commitment. In an empire focused on cultural absorption, their appearance became quiet protest. In ancient Gaul, during Julius Caesar's military campaigns, Celtic warriors were famous for their wild, lime-washed hair, standing rigid and bright, frequently styled into mohawk-like peaks. Roman chroniclers considered it primitive, but for Gauls, it served as war paint expressed through hair follicles. These hairstyles both intimidated opponents and united tribes resisting Roman invasion. The Parthians, and subsequently the Sassanids, two mighty empires located east of Rome, also used appearance as a weapon. Their rulers wore lengthy curled hair and full beards, symbols of divine right and cultural dignity. Romans viewed it as foreign and unmanly. Persians saw it as regal and traditional. Their hair became a declaration: "We are not you." Even within more restrictive societies, hair could serve as resistance. Enslaved populations across various empires from Greece to the Americas were frequently forced to shave their heads to eliminate identity markers. When possible, they employed hair to preserve heritage, memory, and defiance. Braids hid seeds, beads carried significance, and styles reconstructed maps, legends, or coded communications. Women also rebelled through hairstyles. In Sparta, unmarried women notably wore short hair contrasting with the long locks of other Greek women, expressing independence and physical preparedness. Roman women occasionally abandoned current court fashions to embrace philosophical principles such as Stoicism or early Christianity, choosing simpler, humble styles. When emperors fell from power, their signature hairstyles disappeared with them. Cutting imperial-style hair could be dangerous, but represented a bold declaration of political loyalty or opposition. In all these instances, hair wasn't merely reflecting society. It became an instrument to transform it across ancient civilizations. When voices faced silence or conflicts erupted, the scalp transformed into a canvas of resistance. A braid, a buzz cut, a curl could communicate more powerfully than spoken words ever could.